Just days ago, the investigation into the death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells took another major turn. As pressure continues to build, the family's legal team is now urging authorities to make arrests, while prosecutors prepare to eventually present the case to a grand jury. Yet despite weeks of investigation, no one has been charged. Before we begin, if you enjoy true crime documentaries built on verified facts rather than speculation, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It really helps YouTube recommend our investigations to more people, allowing us to continue producing content like this. Now, this isn't just the story of a young college football player who disappeared during a 4th of July trip. It's the story of conflicting timelines, missing digital evidence, unanswered questions, and an investigation that has divided an entire community. I'm Alex, and this is True Crime Sessions. Tonight, Daniel has spent days reviewing the available evidence, public records, official statements, and the timeline investigators have been trying to piece together. So let's go back to where this story began. Daniel, take it from here.
When investigators first began reconstructing the final hours of Nolan Wells' life, they quickly realized this wasn't going to be a straightforward case. Every interview, every witness statement, every digital record seemed to answer one question while raising another. But before any of those contradictions existed, before the headlines, the press conferences, and the national attention, Nolan was simply an 18-year-old looking forward to one more summer weekend with friends. On the evening of July 3, 2026, Nolan was home with his family in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. There was nothing unusual about that night. No arguments, no signs that anything was about to change forever. According to his mother, one of her last memories of her son was surprisingly ordinary. Nolan cooked salmon for the family before everyone settled in for the night. It was the kind of moment most families never think twice about, until it becomes one of the last memories they ever have together. Those who knew Nolan described him as respectful, disciplined, and incredibly focused on his future. Football wasn't just a hobby, it was the path he had worked toward for years. After graduating from Ocean Springs High School, he had already earned the opportunity to continue his athletic career at Southwest Mississippi Community College. Coaches spoke highly of his work ethic, teammates remembered someone who always brought positive energy, and his family believed he was exactly where he wanted to be in life. In just a few days, Nolan was expected to return to training with his team, preparing for another season and another opportunity to chase his dreams. Like many 18-year-olds, he had his entire future ahead of him. The next morning was Independence Day. Across Mississippi's Gulf Coast, thousands of people were making plans to celebrate the holiday on the water. One of the most popular destinations was Horn Island, a barrier island located roughly 10 miles south of the mainland. Unlike a typical beach, Horn Island is completely undeveloped. There are no roads, no restaurants, no hotels, and no permanent residents. The only way to reach it is by boat, which is exactly why it has become a favorite destination for locals looking to spend the day swimming, fishing, relaxing, and escaping the crowds on the mainland. That morning, Nolan joined a group of friends for what appeared to be a routine holiday outing. According to GPS records later obtained during the investigation, the boat carrying the group left the dock shortly before 10 o'clock that morning and arrived at Horn Island just after 11. By all available accounts, nothing seemed unusual during the trip across the Mississippi Sound. The weather was favorable, the water was calm, and hundreds of other visitors had already begun gathering across different parts of the island to celebrate the 4th of July. Investigators would later estimate that nearly 300 people were on Horn Island throughout the day. Photos and videos recorded by visitors showed families grilling on the beach, boats anchored along the shoreline, music playing in the background, and groups of friends enjoying the holiday together. Somewhere among those hundreds of people was Nolan Wells, spending what should have been another ordinary summer afternoon. As the day continued, Nolan reportedly met a young woman who was also visiting the island. Exactly how much time they spent together and what happened afterward would later become one of the most debated parts of the entire investigation. According to several friends who traveled with him, Nolan eventually told them he intended to remain on the island for a little while longer and would find another ride back to the mainland later that afternoon. On the surface, it sounded like a simple decision, one that wasn't entirely uncommon on a busy holiday when dozens of boats were traveling back and forth between the island and the coast. But almost immediately, that explanation raised questions. Nolan's parents have consistently said they do not believe their son would have willingly stayed behind while the rest of his group returned home. They described him as responsible and organized, someone who wouldn't intentionally separate himself from the very friends he had arrived with, especially on an island that could only be reached by boat. Investigators documented those differing accounts from the very beginning, but at that moment nobody knew how significant that disagreement would become. Because if Nolan truly decided to stay behind on his own, investigators would eventually need to determine what happened after his friends left. But if he never intended to stay, then the timeline everyone had been relying on would immediately come into question. According to official GPS records, the boat departed Horn Island at approximately 4:31 that afternoon. As it made its way back toward the mainland, Nolan Wells was no longer on board. At first, there was no indication that anything had gone terribly wrong. Those on the boat believed Nolan had made his own decision to remain on the island and expected he would return later with someone else. If that was indeed the plan, investigators have never publicly identified who was supposed to bring him back or whether that arrangement had actually been made at all. What seemed like a simple explanation on the afternoon of July 4th would soon become the first major gap in a timeline filled with unanswered questions. Because as daylight faded over Horn Island, Nolan Wells was alone. And within just a few hours, his family would begin searching for him. By the time the boat pulled away from Horn Island at approximately 4:31 p.m., everyone on board believed the day had simply come to an end. According to those who later spoke with investigators, there was no panic, no immediate concern, and no indication that anything had happened to Nolan Wells. The explanation seemed straightforward. He had decided to remain on the island a little longer and planned to find another ride back to the mainland. On a busy 4th of July weekend, with dozens of private boats anchored along the shoreline and hundreds of visitors scattered across the beach, that story initially sounded believable. But as investigators would later discover, what appears reasonable in the moment doesn't always withstand closer examination. One of the first questions detectives attempted to answer was remarkably simple. If Nolan intended to leave with another boat, who was that person? Publicly, no official timeline has ever identified the individual who was supposedly going to bring him back. No confirmed witness has stepped forward saying they agreed to transport him. Whether such an arrangement actually existed, or whether it was simply an assumption made by others, remains one of the earliest unanswered questions in the case. As daylight slowly began to fade over Horn Island, Nolan was no longer with the group he had arrived with that morning. From that point forward, investigators would spend weeks trying to reconstruct his movements, relying on witness interviews, cell phone data, GPS records, surveillance footage from the mainland, and digital forensic evidence. Yet despite all of those resources, many portions of the timeline remain incomplete. According to accounts provided during the investigation, Nolan was seen interacting with several people throughout the afternoon. Witnesses described him moving between different groups on the beach, something that wasn't unusual considering the number of visitors celebrating the holiday. At one point, he reportedly spent time with a young woman he had met on the island. That encounter has received significant attention online, but investigators have never publicly suggested that she was involved in any criminal activity. Instead, they interviewed individuals who may have been among the last people to see Nolan before he disappeared. As the investigation progressed, detectives quickly found themselves dealing with a common problem in large public gatherings. Hundreds of people had been present. Memories differed. Timelines overlapped. Some witnesses remembered seeing Nolan late in the afternoon. Others believed they had seen him earlier. A few accounts appeared to contradict one another entirely. None of that is uncommon in complex investigations, especially when detectives begin interviewing large numbers of people days after an event. Even honest witnesses can unintentionally remember times incorrectly or confuse one interaction with another. For investigators, separating reliable information from imperfect recollections became one of the first major challenges. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, Nolan's family had no reason to believe anything was wrong. As far as they knew, he was spending Independence Day with friends and would likely return sometime that evening. But as the hours passed, something began to feel unusual. Family members later explained that Nolan wasn't someone who simply disappeared without letting people know where he was. He stayed in contact, answered messages, and maintained close relationships with those around him. The longer they went without hearing from him, the more concerned they became. Eventually, those concerns turned into alarm. Attempts to reach Nolan reportedly went unanswered. Calls weren't returned. Messages received no response. For any parent, there comes a moment when ordinary worry begins giving way to something much heavier. As night settled over Mississippi's Gulf Coast, Nolan's family found themselves entering that uncertain space where every unanswered phone call creates another unanswered question. While his loved ones searched for information, investigators would later begin examining Nolan's cell phone activity in extraordinary detail. In almost every modern missing person investigation, a smartphone becomes one of the most valuable pieces of evidence available. It can reveal movements, communication, location history, application usage, and interactions that help detectives reconstruct a person's final known hours. In Nolan's case, however, the cell phone would eventually become one of the most disputed pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Questions surrounding when it was recovered, how it was examined, what digital information could be extracted, and whether any crucial data had been lost would later fuel intense public debate. Digital forensic specialists interviewed by various media outlets explained that modern smartphones often preserve valuable information even after files have been deleted, provided investigators gain timely access and maintain a proper chain of custody. Those discussions only increased public interest in what investigators had, or had not, been able to recover from Nolan's device. At the same time, social media began filling with theories. Some people believed Nolan had simply left the island with another group. Others speculated that something violent had happened before anyone realized he was missing. Within days, rumors were spreading faster than verified information, making the work of investigators even more difficult. Every new claim had to be evaluated, compared against available evidence, and either supported or eliminated. Many of the stories circulating online were never confirmed, yet they continued reaching thousands of people, creating an environment where speculation often traveled faster than facts. As detectives worked behind the scenes, another reality became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a missing person investigation. With every passing hour, the chances of finding clear answers became increasingly dependent on one thing: the accuracy of the timeline. Because somewhere between the moment Nolan's friends believed they had left him safely behind and the moment his family realized he wasn't coming home, something had happened. The challenge facing investigators was determining exactly what that something was. And before long, the search for Nolan Wells would become a recovery mission. On July 6th, nearly 2 days after Nolan Wells was last seen on Horn Island, the search came to a heartbreaking end. His body was discovered on the island, transforming what had begun as a missing person investigation into a death investigation almost instantly. From that moment forward, every conversation shifted away from where Nolan was and toward what had happened during the hours no one could fully account for. For investigators, the discovery marked the beginning of a much more complex phase. Recovering a body is only the first step. Determining how that person died, whether anyone else was involved, and whether a crime occurred, requires a careful examination of physical evidence, forensic testing, witness interviews, digital records, and medical findings. Every piece of information must fit together before investigators can confidently establish what happened. As news of Nolan's death spread across Mississippi, public attention intensified almost overnight. Family, friends, classmates, teammates, and complete strangers began demanding answers. What had initially appeared to be an isolated incident was now drawing statewide and eventually national attention. Questions flooded social media, local news stations devoted extensive coverage to the case, and online discussions generated thousands of theories, many of them presented as fact despite having little or no supporting evidence. Throughout the investigation, authorities repeatedly urged the public not to confuse speculation with verified information. That distinction became increasingly important. Over the following weeks, countless claims circulated online. Some alleged Nolan had returned to the mainland after leaving Horn Island. Others claimed he attended a party later that evening. There were stories involving confrontations, cover-ups, hidden surveillance footage, and witnesses who supposedly knew more than they had told investigators. Despite how widely those stories spread, none of those allegations have been publicly confirmed by law enforcement. Investigators have acknowledged interviewing numerous witnesses and reviewing a significant amount of digital evidence, but many of the rumors that dominated social media remain unsupported by official findings. As public speculation continued to grow, Nolan's family became increasingly vocal about their concerns regarding the investigation. They questioned whether every available lead had been pursued. They questioned how certain pieces of evidence had been handled. Most importantly, they questioned whether the investigation had moved quickly enough during the critical early stages. Those concerns eventually led the family to retain nationally recognized civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who announced that his legal team would conduct its own independent review while continuing to push for greater transparency from investigators. One of the central issues raised by the family involved Nolan's cell phone. Although investigators confirmed they had examined the device, relatively little information has been released publicly regarding what digital evidence it contained or what role it ultimately played in reconstructing Nolan's final hours. Digital forensic specialists interviewed during media coverage explained why that device could be so significant. Modern smartphones often preserve location history, communication records, application activity, photographs, and metadata capable of helping investigators establish an accurate timeline. Whether those records answered key questions or introduced new ones has not been fully disclosed. As pressure mounted, the investigation continued expanding. Authorities interviewed additional witnesses. Electronic devices underwent forensic examination. GPS data was reviewed. Surveillance footage from locations connected to the case was collected wherever available. Eventually, federal authorities also became involved, with the FBI assisting aspects of the investigation. While the Bureau has not publicly detailed the scope of its participation, its involvement reflected the growing complexity and public importance of the case. At the same time, prosecutors confirmed that once investigators complete their work, the evidence will be presented to a grand jury, which will determine whether criminal charges are warranted. That announcement represented an important milestone, but it did not answer the questions so many people continued asking. What actually happened to Nolan Wells? Today, that question remains unanswered in the public record. No arrests have been announced. No suspect has been publicly identified. Investigators have continued emphasizing that the case remains active, while the family continues calling for accountability and urging anyone with relevant information to come forward. Cases like this often become defined not only by the evidence investigators possess, but also by the evidence they are still trying to obtain. Every verified witness statement, every forensic examination, every digital record, and every unanswered gap in the timeline contributes to a larger picture that investigators are still attempting to complete. For that reason, it is important to separate what is known from what is merely believed. We know Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island with friends on the morning of July 4th. We know the boat he arrived on left without him later that afternoon. We know his body was discovered 2 days later. We know investigators have reviewed witness testimony, GPS records, digital evidence, and forensic findings while continuing to examine the circumstances surrounding his death. Beyond those established facts, many of the claims that continue circulating online remain exactly that, claims. Until investigators release additional evidence or prosecutors present their case in court, many of the questions surrounding Nolan's final hours will remain unanswered. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this investigation isn't simply what happened on Horn Island. It's how many questions still remain despite weeks of interviews, forensic examinations, and public scrutiny. For Nolan's family, the search has never truly ended. It has simply become a search for the truth. And until investigators can fully explain what happened during those missing hours on July 4th, The case of Nolan Wells will continue to leave an entire community waiting for answers. Alex, back to you.
Thank you for watching this investigation. As of the publication of this documentary, the death of Nolan Wells remains an active investigation. Authorities continue reviewing evidence, the family continues demanding answers, and prosecutors have confirmed that the case will eventually be presented to a grand jury. Until that process is complete, many of the questions surrounding Nolan's final hours remain unanswered. Here at True Crime Sessions, our commitment is simple. We don't chase rumors, and we don't present speculation as fact. We follow the evidence, the official records, and the timeline, allowing you to see the case for yourself and reach your own conclusions. Now we'd like to hear from you. After everything you've seen in this documentary, what part of the timeline raises the biggest question in your mind? Was there a moment that stood out to you? Let us know in the comments. We read every discussion, and your perspective may highlight details others have overlooked. If you found this investigation valuable, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It takes only a second, but it genuinely helps YouTube recommend our documentaries to more people, allowing us to continue producing carefully researched investigations like this one. And if there are any significant developments in the Nolan Wells case, whether new evidence, official announcements, or court proceedings, we'll be here to break them down and separate verified facts from speculation. Until then, I'm Alex. Thank you for watching True Crime Sessions. We'll see you in the next investigation.